The first thing a plaintiff has to do in a contracts action is prove that there is a contract. And in order to do that, the first step is to consider contract formation. This is one of the most important parts of the contracts outline, and I think it's also one of the parts that people study too much. There's a ton of minutia here, and it allows us to get all confused in this morass of details. The great thing about contract formation is that basically, it's really quite simple, and if you understand the simplicity of it, then you're able to assimilate some of the more intricate details without getting bogged down and confused. One thing that you have to keep in mind up front about contract formation is it's harder to form a contract at the common law than it is under the UCC. The biggest difference between the UCC and the common law is in this area of contract formation. Contracts between merchants can be formed a lot easier than all other contracts. And we'll focus separately on the UCC at the end of this presentation, but throughout our consideration of the law of contracts, we will also acknowledge where there are important distinctions between the common law and the UCC. So, we're dealing with contract formation, and there's only three parts to it: offer, acceptance, and consideration. And all three of these different areas, offer, acceptance, and consideration, are subject to testing on the multi-state. And we'll also see they're subject to testing on the essays. This is material that you have to understand, but it is not material that you have to memorize in great depth. If you understand that the basics of formation include offer, acceptance, and consideration, and you have some idea about how each of these are established, that little bit of knowledge will really carry you quite a far distance. And we'll see in some essay questions that just knowing that basic structure is really all you need to know in order to have a reasonably good chance of writing a successful answer. So, we're dealing with offer, acceptance, and consideration. Obviously, the starting point is offer. In order for there to be a valid offer, the person making the offer, the offeror, has to intend to be making an offer. So, if the words that are being used by the plaintiff to establish an offer are words of jest or ambiguous words where the intent is unclear, especially at common law, it's unlikely that there will be a valid offer. So, once we establish that the offeror has the intent to make an offer, we have to examine the contents of that offer in order to determine whether or not it really is an offer. So, the contents of an offer include the intent to be bound, the content, and then the communication to the offeree. The content of the offer is where some of the complicated nuts and bolts come in. At common law, the basics of an offer had to include the parties, the subject matter, and the price. Under the UCC, we see that each one of these can be fudged quite a bit, a surprising amount, if you're not initiated in the law of contract. But the basics of an offer include the intent to be bound, and then the parties, the subject matter, and the price being somehow communicated to the offeree. That's basically all that's required. But let's for a moment pause and think about one additional layer of complexity. Suppose we've got a situation where the offeror has in fact made a valid offer. How can that offer be revoked? And the answer is basically any reasonable way. Suppose we've got a situation where the contract would be subject to the statute of frauds. In other words, it has to be in writing. The revocation of an offer to that kind of a contract doesn't need to be in writing. Any reasonable communication will suffice. Now, let's go to the highest level of detail that I'm going to choose to immerse us in, and that is the intricacies of what's known as the Mailbox Rule. Now, if you're sharp on the Mailbox Rule, you know the Mailbox Rule is focusing on acceptance, and that an acceptance is valid upon dispatch. But we're still dealing with the offer, and in particular with the revocation of an offer. Now, for a revocation to be successful, it will be judged not when it is sent, but when it's received. And that's true whether the offeror has revoked or whether the offeree has rejected. So, the Mailbox Rule only deals with acceptance and it is effective upon dispatch. When an offer is either withdrawn by the offeror or rejected by the offeree, those rejections are effective upon receipt. And that's really about as complicated as these mailbox issues get. That's really all you need to know. If you know that much and can spot the issue, you're rolling. You have everything that you need to be able to pass the question. I encourage you to go forth and practice this material with as much vigor as you can bring to the task. And you'll see the questions about offer and acceptance typically are very straightforward. Now, let's move on to consider acceptance. Acceptance at the common law had to basically mirror the offer. The offeree would have to assent to the deal as presented, and anything short of that would be a counteroffer, which would be deemed to be a rejection of the initial offer. So, in order for there to be a valid acceptance, we've got to have an offeree with the power of acceptance. So if we make an offer to a specific individual, unless there's something about that offer that might be interpreted more broadly, only that specific offeree has got the power to accept. Also, the terms of acceptance have to be unequivocal, and at common law they have to be a mirror image of the offer. But remember, under the UCC, there can be, particularly between merchants, we can have an acceptance quite different from the offer that is still binding on the parties, assuming that the original offeror doesn't object or make some comment within a reasonable period of time. And then the last step of acceptance is the mailbox rule, which we've already touched upon. In order for an acceptance to be deemed valid, it has to be communicated to the offeror, and that communication is deemed effective upon dispatch. Now, suppose we've got a situation where the offeree does not communicate in any form an acceptance, but with the knowledge of the offeror begins performance. Where the offeror knows that the offeree has begun performance, I think it is pretty safe to say that acceptance will be inferred and that the parties will be deemed bound to the contract. Now, a related idea is Quasi Contract, a theory of liability that arises out of a relationship that appears to be fundamentally contractual, but is not supported by a binding agreement. Quasi Contract is the plaintiff's theory of liability when the contract's theory fails. And remember that the basic idea of Quasi Contract is the plaintiff is pursuing a restitutionary remedy in order to avoid the unjust enrichment of the defendant, as opposed to a contracts plaintiff who typically is seeking damages in order to be made whole within the agreement. That's the key difference between damages and restitution. In damages, we focus on the plaintiff and we seek to make the plaintiff whole. In restitution, we focus on the defendant and we seek to avoid unjust enrichment. So here in contract formation, we need to acknowledge that where a contract fails, but a party is still enriched by the relationship, quasi-contract becomes the preferred theory of liability. We focus on the potential undue enrichment of the defendant, and to the extent the plaintiff can prove it up, the plaintiff will be entitled to a restitutionary remedy, typically measured in dollars. Finally, we turn to consideration. Once we've got an offer, and once we've got an acceptance, we've got to evaluate consideration. The essence of consideration is that the parties have made a deal. They've had a bargain and they've made an exchange. So that's where the phrase bargained for exchange comes from. That's the consideration that must come from both parties in order for there to be a valid contract. Now, what counts is whether or not there has been a real exchange. We are much less concerned about whether that exchange is proportionate. So suppose we've got parties. We'll call them A and B. And let's suppose these parties are exchanging two parcels of real estate. They're swapping real estate. And let's suppose that one of these parcels is a broken down location of a former gas station, and it's a toxic waste problem, and it's in a bad neighborhood where everybody is broke and violent. And let's suppose the other parcel is in a fancy neighborhood where everybody's got an acre and a swimming pool, and we're all rich in the other neighborhood. Would the contract to exchange the broken down ex-gas station location for a fancy residence in a rich neighborhood fail for lack of consideration? Answer, no, because the exchange is meaningful on both sides, even though it's proportionate. Now, suppose we change the facts a little bit. Suppose we've got a situation where A says to B, I will let you have Blackacre if you will trouble yourself by going down to the recording office and recording this deed. That's not a contract, and the mere act of going to register a deed isn't enough to be considered valid consideration. That looks much more like a donative promise, which is freely revocable in the absence of real consideration. Now, suppose we've got a situation where one party has fully performed under a contract that is otherwise binding and the other party has not, and then that breaching party comes and brings as a defense the fact that the consideration was disproportionate. Is that a defense to breach of contract? The short answer is probably not, but we'd have to carefully examine the facts, and the closer those facts appeared to mirror a donation rather than a deal, there might be a valid defense. But the typical answer on bar exam MBE questions is the consideration will not fail as a result of it being disproportionate. Now, compare that to an illusory promise. This is a complicated defense, and it requires examining the facts very carefully. Suppose we've got a situation where, on its face, it appears the contract has a valid bargain for exchange, but then buried in the depths of the agreement, we come to find that one party basically has a complete escape clause and can avoid performance under just about any circumstances. Well, if we look at that situation, here we could find that the promise made by the party with the escape clause is illusory, and that that party really hasn't bargained away anything at all. Under those circumstances, where one party's escape clauses are so thorough that they basically absolve him or her of any liability under any circumstances, that's not a real contract. That looks much more like a deal that's going to fail for being an illusory promise. And that's basically it for considering offer, acceptance, and consideration. In a little bit more than 12 minutes, I've given you all of the basic information that you need to handle these problems. I encourage you to go forth and practice this material. There's no doubt you'll learn a lot of law by doing that practice, but you'll see as you engage in that practice that the basic framework I've given you here is a fine foundation. Next, we're going to turn our attention to substitutes for consideration, and then we'll consider defenses to the formation of contracts.